Drew here, and to the credit of Jupiter's Legacy, I had a really hard time watching other things yesterday. I was really anxious to get back to the show and to finish it. So that's kind of an endorsement there. To its discredit, I found the last 5 episodes kind of hard to sit through. I think the pacing was just not very good. And instead of developing the plot further, it just kept adding character after character and not giving you the payoffs to the big parts of the story. Like, I think that they've kind of pushed everything off until season 2. There was one big defining moment from the comics by Mark Millar that I was really expecting to be in this season. And I was actually expecting it to happen, 3 or 4 episodes into the season at the latest. And it still hadn't happened by the end of the season, which really surprised me. And my frustration here is I think that this show, because they decided to hold off on this defining moment for the story, this inciting incident, I think it left the back half of the season without much to do. A lot of characters, some of the best characters from the comics, were kind of in a holding pattern, just like waiting for their part of the story to start. And I know why they did this. It was so that they could give a bigger role to Brandon Sampson / Utopia, played by Josh Duhamel. And he does a very nice job here, don't get me wrong. I really appreciated his performance. But the cost is that other characters, such as Hutch, played by Ian Quinlan, and Chloe, played by Elena Kampouris, their characters really don't get enough to do, and what they do doesn't really have much relevance to the overall plot, because they're in a holding pattern until that big inciting incident takes place. So to me, this show was too busy making plans for a second season that may never happen instead of making the best first season it could possibly have made. Now, the first 3 episodes, I came in not expecting to like this series. In the first 10 minutes, I was like, well, this is kind of overly self-serious. And I kind of was like, I bet critics aren't going to like this. And I went and looked it up, and sure enough, as of the time that I went and looked it up, it was 32% on Rotten Tomatoes. And I said, well, that checks out. I thought that this series would be liked, but it doesn't really seem to have an idea of how it's differentiating itself from the other superhero fare out there. It's not, it's not a big budget superhero movie, so there's limitations on the action and on other elements. And it's not subversive like The Boys, although the superhero show that it probably reminds me the most of is The Boys. So to me, I was a little bit not certain what the pull was. Even though I've read the comic, I was like, I don't understand what tone they're going for here. But as it went on, in the first 3 episodes, as I said, I came in not expecting to like it. It grew on me, and by the end of episode 3, I was telling my wife, I really like this show. I think you might like it, even. Because while it was flawed, like, it was overly serious, and for people that like their superhero fare to be a little bit more ironically self-aware like Marvel, or more subversive like The Boys, you might not like this because it is very serious. It's more for people that would like a Zack Snyder approach to superheroes, which I understand the knocks on Zack Snyder, but there are people that like that approach. And I was into it, even though there was a lot of on-the-nose speeches and kind of hackneyed dialogue, but I was still kind of enjoying it despite all of these flaws. And then episode 4 happened, and then the pacing really just flagged, because what I expected to happen was for the story to escalate into the big event that happens in the comics. And I will talk about what I'm talking about at the end of this review once I get into the spoiler section, but for now I'm trying to avoid spoilers. But they really needed that moment to happen at the midpoint of this series, because it's the inciting incident. It's the thing that gives every character's actions purpose. And without it, it's really, there's just not enough going on in the story that's unique or interesting. I was enjoying the discussions. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff in that regard. Questions that perhaps aren't as deep as the showrunners think they are, but still, like, much deeper than a lot of the superhero stories we've seen lately. Somewhat hearkening back to Watchmen and other deeper superhero fare. And I was interested in that. I was interested in the discussion of morality. There's this whole aspect where Utopia wants them to hold on to this moral standard that was kind of arbitrarily decided upon by him and maybe doesn't have value anymore. And he's kind of pushing it on his son, Brandon, played by Andrew Horton, and on all the superheroes. And he's arguing that if that standard is ever let go of not killing their enemies, of just putting them away in prison, then, the center will not hold, that subjective morality will take over and there will be huge problems. And, I think that it's an interesting discussion. I think it's pretty obvious the showrunners might admire someone like Brandon Sampson, but they think that there's problems with this way of thinking, and they kind of highlight some of them. But to be fair, they also highlight some problems with not having objective standards. They show that, sometimes when you don't have a standard, where do you stop? Where do you decide the line is? If you don't have a line, then how are people supposed to decide when they've gone too far? So that was a really interesting discussion. And the problem, of course, there were other interesting discussions. I think there was an interesting aspect of how involved should superheroes be. Obviously, these are not new things that this show is the first to explore. Watchmen explored a lot of this, but they explore, how should a superhero interact with government? Should it allow people to make decisions for themselves, even if those are bad decisions, or should they step in and tell people how it's going to be for their own good? But again, who are they to decide? There's an element of fascism in that kind of thinking. So this is all interesting stuff, but the discussions go about as far as they're going to go in the third episode, and there really wasn't a whole lot of more development after that. Instead, the characters kind of go on this Easter egg hunt, trying to hunt down. There's an origin story for the characters where they're going on this Easter egg hunt that had a lot of shades of Peter Jackson and the other version of King Kong, where they go to a mysterious island and track down this strange location. And without getting into spoilers, it's explaining how they got their powers in the past. And it's taking place during the Great Depression. Again, shades of Peter Jackson's King Kong. So this stuff was all, it was okay, but it went on far too long. And there were episodes of it where it was just characters going to locations, trying to figure out mysteries, and not really learning anything. And this was where the pacing really flagged. And I honestly, I really like the character of Chloe in the comic. And I feel like the character is wasted here because we only really get to see her being a drugged out child of Brandon Sampson and Grace Sampson, who has just decided, because she can't live up to her father's expectations, to just go completely the other way. Unlike her brother Brandon, she's just given up on trying to meet her father's standards. And she's a really interesting character in the comics, but she has nothing to do here except do drugs and hang out with the other really awesome character from the comics, Hutch, here played by Ian Quinlan. And like I said, neither of these characters have really much to do. Hutch has some great scenes with his power set as the son of someone who was a villain, and he's a little bit more of a morally ambiguous character, and his powers are really cool, and the way that he gets to use them is really cool. But his character has nothing really to do that's relevant to the main plot, because he and Chloe are in a holding pattern until the inciting incident from the comics takes place. And for some reason, they thought that they could get through this whole season without having that happen, which I find extremely frustrating. If they had had it happen earlier, there would have been a lot more interest in the back half of this season. I think they should have made this a mini-series instead of trying to make it a multi-season affair. I think that's where they went wrong. And if they wanted to go and expand the story past what happens in the comics, they could have done that. But trying to expand the story in the comics to multiple seasons, it's just a mistake. I think that there's a lot of interesting characters. I haven't even mentioned Brainwave, played by Ben Daniels, who's a very interesting character, and George, played by Matt Lanter, who's a really interesting character. But, there's so many characters, and you get into episode 4 and you think that there's a lot of characters to keep track of already, and then they start introducing more characters. And a lot of them just seem completely superfluous. And as I said, they go on an Easter egg hunt, the story keeps adding characters, and the plot just stops developing. And the question, these explorations of the themes, really, really slow down, drag to a crawl, and the season really ends on a low note, which I found particularly frustrating. So to me, like, this show had a lot of potential. If you're someone who's not interested in superhero fare, or if you're only interested in, exceptional superhero fare or something with a twist, then this was never going to be for you, and that's okay. But I'm someone who has a hard time. I knew I was going to watch this show, whether it was good or whether it was not good, because part of me still just likes superhero stories, but you have to hold them accountable at some point. And this series, I think they tried really hard to make it interesting. And I appreciate that it is actually about something. It has a story, it has a plot, it's developed characters and motivations, and it's not just, the good guy with the powers fights the bad guy who wants to blow up the world. Like, it's a lot more complex than your typical superhero fare. But I feel that the pacing and the writing are just too flawed for me to give this a pass. Now, getting into spoilers, I talked to my wife about this show, and I was trying to make her understand why the comics were interesting, because I don't read that many comics, but I really did like these comics. And I told her, well, that character played by Josh Duhamel, Brandon Sampson, he dies very early on, and then it's about his flawed kids trying to learn how to deal with his legacy. Well, I would never have spoiled that for her if I had known that he was still going to be alive at the end of this season, because to me that was one of the defining moments of the story. It's like the death of Ned Stark in Game of Thrones, or the game of Mufasa, or the death of Mufasa in The Lion King. Like, those are the defining moments of those stories in a big way. And to me it was really frustrating, because this story, it's basically superhero This Is Us. That dawned on me as it was going on, with flashbacks to establish the impact that the past has had on different characters. And from that perspective, it was really working for me as a family drama with some superhero action thrown into the mix. But then episode 4 did this heel turn, and the rest of the story, like I said, it becomes this Easter egg hunt as they go to this island to get, solve this mystery, kind of similar to Lost. And far too long was spent on this, because it was really, really a simple Easter egg hunt at the end of the day. They're just getting to an island to get some powers from a mysterious source that seems to be Jupiter. The planet Jupiter somehow is giving them these powers. And it never really goes a lot deeper than that. Like, there's a lot of interesting iconography and images, but they never really explain what's going on deeper than, well, they're testing you to see if you're worthy of these powers and if you can work together for the good of humanity. And to me, you could still have Josh Duhamel's Brandon Sampson have a major role in this series and still have him die in episode 3 or 4 because of the flashbacks. That gives you the potential to do that. And I think the moment when Brainwave ultimately betrays his brother and Brandon takes his side because of the very rigid morality that Utopia exemplifies, I think that's like the defining moment of the comic, and you have to have it for people to understand what makes this story unique and interesting. And to not have it, it just doesn't work. There's nothing holding this whole season together without that moment, and I think it needed to happen honestly early on. If I was hoping when I got to the last episode that it would at least happen at the end of the season, but they decided, no, we're going to hold that off until next season, if it ever happens. Like, maybe they've just decided that Utopia will be around forever. But I found that frustrating. There were a lot of things that I enjoyed here. Like I said, I found a lot of the acting to be pretty decent. Some of it was subpar or average, but I found there were a lot of really, really compelling cast members. I'm particularly interested to see them do more with the character of Hutch. I think Ian Quinlan seems like a really, really charismatic performer, and I'm interested to see what he can do with a plotline where he's actually integrated into the main story. But here he was kind of just off on his own side quest, stealing random stuff, and it never really got explained how what he was doing fit into the plotline with Utopia and the other characters. Now, the way they revealed the final twist that Brainwave had been behind the release of this evil alien supervillain from prison, I thought that was cleverly done, and I think that that shows kind of some of the power of what could happen next season. But to me, the frustration is that they didn't really, it could have been so impactful because in the comics it's revealed in the moment that he betrays Utopia. So to me, that was a much more powerful moment in the comics, and they're not going to be able to replicate that now because we know what Brainwave is up to and we know why. And honestly, it was frustrating to me that they really didn't spend much of the season building up to this betrayal. I feel like they kind of muddled the messaging by kind of making a lot of it with Utopia instead of about the moral issues of, postmodernism versus objective morality that we can't ever deviate from no matter, like what the circumstances are. To me, the frustration was they spent a lot of time like distracting us with themes about, oh, well, he was the favorite son over Brainwave, and jealousy, sibling issues, or, oh, he wasn't around enough when we were kids, which are not really related to the other aspects. To me, like, those didn't need to be included because they're kind of actually a distraction and they're kind of cliched as well. I felt like the death of Reiku, played by Anna Akana, the daughter of Brainwave, like the way that this played out to me was frustrating as well because she, again, I felt like she had potential like Hutch to be one of the better characters, and I feel like they should have at least integrated her into season 2 before having her killed. I feel like having her die this way was them trying to make up for the fact that they weren't following through on the Utopia death, but they introduced her so late in the season that we really didn't get to see her do a lot of cool stuff. She was really only in it for like a couple episodes before they killed her off. So overall, I can't really in good conscience recommend this series unless you're just like determined to watch it. To me, it was more frustrating in the pacing and in a lot of the character development than something that I felt entertained and excited by. But everyone's going to have a different reaction to it. So let me know what you thought in the comments. If you're interested in seeing my upcoming reviews of other shows, please consider subscribing to the channel. As always, thank you for watching.